So you probably know that HDMI 2.1 with an AMD GPU on Linux is kind of a no-go. This doesn't mean the port itself doesn't work, it just runs at the lower 2.0 speeds. What this means in real-world terms kind of depends on what you're trying to do, but you do have a limit of 4K 60Hz. Also, if you're trying to do variable refresh rate over HDMI, it may or may not work, because in 2.0, it wasn't a core part of the specs, so some hardware is going to be fine, but unless they list out their spec sheet, you're probably not going to know until you test it. With 2.1, you can do 4K 120Hz, obviously, you're probably not doing that, but at 1080p, you can do well over 500Hz, and we are starting to see gaming monitors that are getting into that range. Also, variable refresh rate is a core part of the spec, along with a bunch of other niceties. Now, the blocker, as you're going to see from this video, isn't technical, and we've talked about this in prior videos. It is licensing from the HDMI Forum, who don't want to let their members develop a full open source implementation. NVIDIA does support it on Linux in their proprietary stack. Intel actually has a dongle built into the port, so whilst it looks like an HDMI port, it's actually just a DisplayPort in the background, and that works perfectly fine. If you want to use 2.1 on Linux, you can also use a dongle that turns a DisplayPort into 2.1. That is totally fine as well. AMD, they have an open source stack, and they haven't gone down the Intel route, so users are basically left with a GPU that, with the HDMI port, cannot do everything it's supposed to be able to do. This does put Valve into a bit of a fun situation with the Steam Machine, which has the hardware to run at HDMI 2.1 speeds, and on Windows, runs at HDMI 2.1 speeds. But on Linux, they do advertise 4K 120Hz, even though 2.0 can't do that. So what they're actually doing is using chroma subsampling, which is going to crush the video quality, but it does work. To be fair, you're probably not playing anything at 4K 120 on the Steam Machine anyway, except Stardew Valley, so it's not the biggest of deals. However, it would be nice to have the hardware be able to run like the hardware says it can. But what if you were not a member of the HDMI Forum? What if you were just a guy, you had an AMD GPU, you used Linux, and you had a code editor? Well, you would be this developer by the name of MKOPEC, who has been working on the problem. This is a set of kernel patches which has not yet been upstreamed, and I have my doubts about it getting upstream. We'll talk about that a bit later, to fix HDMI FRL. In this case, that means fixed rate link. This is basically what is needed by HDMI 2.1 to run at the higher bandwidth. Here's just a random little side note about HDMI, which is not at all important, but I did want to mention it here. Much like the USB Implementers Forum who design USB, the HDMI Forum is also really bad at branding. So this created a situation where you are seeing HDMI 2.1 products, which are not actually HDMI 2.1 because they don't actually conform to the standard, because the standard has like a bunch of things that are optional and like a bunch of things you can like add to it, and it's like a whole mess. So not at all important here, just wanted to bring it up because HDMI kinda sucks. Anyway, the dev announced this work over on Reddit. HDMI 2.1 FRL looking for testers. I've successfully managed to implement HDMI FRL in AMD GPU, enabling full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth on your AMD GPUs. Mostly, there's still some work to be done. The dev hasn't done full testing. They don't have a full range of AMD GPUs that support 2.1, so on their card it works. And on the cards that have been tested so far, it works. So it probably consistently works, but more testing needs to be done. The current state, FRL training works, video and audio work, HDR works, VRR initially didn't, but now does, hot plug and DPMS work, dynamic selection of the required FRL rate for a given mode is implemented. So basically, it mostly works. However, caveats. Things are still in development. And honestly, this is what you should expect when it's being done through reverse engineering because, well, the HDMI Forum doesn't want to let the people who can see the specification actually go and implement it. So you're going to have someone who is trying to like piece together things that are causing problems and try to implement those different things. So you're going to have areas where things are a little bit kind of wonky, at least for a while. There is a number of open issues. If you do want to go and test this, be sure to actually go and report any problems you see. And if you want to help out, do go and help out, especially if you have some cards that have not yet been tested. Only DCN 4.0.1, that is Display Core Next, that is the part of the AMD GPU that actually does the core GPU work. Only that has been tested, at least as of the writing of this. A few other cards have been tested, but not that many of them. Other GPUs should work similarly, but these parts are completely untested. There may be some clock dependencies there that have not been implemented or figured out yet, hence me looking for testers today, but do prepare for the possibility the kernel might not even boot. So, if you are looking to test this, don't make it your only kernel. Have a backup. Or a secondary machine. Either works. Untested DCN generations include 3.1 to 3.6. DCN 3.0, the RX 6000 series, has not been implemented yet, but I believe it should be pretty similar to newer DCNs. Also, certain displays like his Samsung S95B may not work correctly. This requires a restart. Why it does, who knows? I'm sure he's going to work it out over time, but especially if you have some weird, random, cheap displays. Honestly, I'm surprised Samsung's do it. Maybe they're doing some weird stuff. Maybe there's something that's just missing here, but especially if you have weird, cheap displays, they very well might be doing something weird and stupid. And DSC is not yet implemented. This is display stream compression. Should be pretty obvious what that does. It lets you compress the video stream so you can fit more on the display. This lets you do some fun things like 1600 hertz refresh rate, even though there's not any hardware that actually supports that. The patches are based mostly on diffing register states on Windows and Linux until they match. On that note, if you do want to help out, very simple thing you can do. Here's looking for dumps of register states on Windows. Knowing what it looks like on Windows, because Windows actually has a working implementation, so that you can compare that with what's happening on Linux and try to kind of make it work. So far, that's been going well. This is like bread and butter reverse engineering. Breakpointing the Windows driver to check what values it sends to DMUB, and publicly available AMD Linux, Intel, AM Logic, and high silicon HDMI FRL training code. So you might think, wait, how does AMD have an implementation? So this is something that was talked about a few months ago. This is a whole separate thing from the AMD GPU driver. It's not full implementation of HDMI 2.1, but you at least have the fixed rate link training there, so it's one thing you don't have to think about. HDMI Forum is a mess, right? I would like them to just allow a full implementation, but no, we gotta do this whole, like, song and dance. Ooh, well, we have a partial implementation here. We have registers here. Ooh, let's do some stupid nonsense to make it work. There had been some further updates. Also, there is an AUR package, so if you want to go and test this for yourself, obviously, you need to have an AMD GPU that supports HDMI 2.1, along with the display that supports HDMI 2.1, otherwise there's nothing to test here. But if you do have all of that, give it a test. See what it's like. Obviously, you don't need to use Arch. You can go and build it for any other distro if you want to, but it is nice to have an AUR package. This does make it very easy to go and test it and go and remove it. From this point, what happens now? So the dev did go and post this over in the AMD thread about HDMI 2.1. So there's not been anything said here. Why did it scroll way up? There's not been anything said here. Basically just the announcement, and that's pretty much where we're at. However, if we look back through the thread, they didn't just show up out of nowhere. There is 32 matches for their name, and the oldest one goes back to around 2023. They have been at least thinking about this issue for quite a while now. Now, I am not his lawyer, but this comment is worth mentioning. The HDMI 2.1 spec has leaked. Obviously, I'm not going to link it here, so any intellectual property the HDMI Forum is trying to protect so hard is already public knowledge. I'm guessing the code written using a leaked spec would never be admissible into the kernel, but the HDMI Forum should be aware that it is no longer protecting any secrets. The only thing it's doing is hurting Linux users. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, he implemented it by looking at the spec. He does explicitly say, if we go down to the bottom, he does explicitly say no secret documentation or specifications were used. Again, I'm not his lawyer. About a month ago, he did also point out the work on Z-Linux. Just want to point out that Z-Linux, which belongs to AMD, has publicly available MIT licensed FRL training code on their GitHub. Other GPL v2 implementations of FRL for Linux can also be found on GitHub. And someone makes a good point. From the likes of Huawei, Rockchip, AM Logic, all GPL v2 code that we can legally use. Is AMD really waiting us, the community, to implement FRL ourselves? We are not beholden to any NDNAs to provide interoperability. Moreover, there's not even any DRM to crack, so that wouldn't even be something to use DMC against in the USA. I would love a chat with the HDMI Forum. What's even the purpose if it's not like companies are suddenly stopping paying royalties if they know how to communicate? It's frustrating such a big company like AMD can figure this out in years. I assume that can't figure this out in years? Dissolving HDMI LA in favor of HDMI Forum was the worst thing ever. Well, I guess Intel chickened out as well with Battlemage, and the public Z-Linux code is just a cherry on top. Now, someone points out that there was other work being worked on for reverse-engineered 2.1 support. From that person we just read the comment from. So this is that work over in the kernel. Whilst that work hasn't been merged, there has been a bit of a back and forth between them and MK OPEC, who, as we saw, is the one who made the most recent version of this implementation. From there's been some further back and forth between the two of them, and then we eventually made our way to this one. So then, upstreaming. Upstreaming, upstreaming, upstreaming. This is a very difficult problem, we'll say. Firstly, to my understanding, the new patches have not been submitted to the kernel and would need to be put into a kernel format. Obviously, they still need some more work to actually be good, so submitting them right now is probably not for the best when you know there are problems with them. But after that point, when it is ready, when it is actually in a good state, what's going to happen? Phoronix, I think, puts it quite well. While it's interesting and the passionate work of open source developers applauded, it's likely not to yield any short-term improvement for AMD Radeon Linux users at large. Besides those wanting to roll their own kernel build with these patches certainly wouldn't be accepted for upstreaming to the AMD GPU driver given HDMI Forum's rejection already and needing to clear AMD's legal review. So remember, AMD works on the AMD GPU driver for Linux. This is an open source project and other people work on it, but AMD is very much involved in that, and they can't give a clear legal review to something that they're not allowed to work on, and then if you have other AMD developers working on a driver that has reverse-engineered code that the HDMI Forum doesn't want to exist, then you're going to have AMD developers working on the reverse-engineered code, which they don't want to have exist. A big legal mess. Now, maybe it's fine. Maybe there's some way you can make it happen, but I agree that this getting merged probably is not going to happen. It may help apply pressure on the HDMI Forum to change course, especially if Valve and other stakeholders get involved. Valve, I don't believe, is involved in the forum, so if they want to do something, maybe if they just ship it with the SteamOS on the Steam machine, that would be very interesting. I don't know if that, like, what the legality there is, but I would be intrigued. But this has been an unfortunate issue going back years already. AMD Linux users are best off using DisplayPort where possible, or if the HDMI Forum doesn't revert their policy, perhaps in some future, AMD GPUs will find more of their HDMI display functionality moved into their binary firmware blobs to make it easier on the open source driver. If the pressure doesn't change anything, then at the very least, distros can choose to apply the patches themselves. I could see a world where a Bazide or a CashieOS goes and adds these patches and then advertises HDMI 2.1 support. And as there is more advertised support, hopefully that is more pressure, and hopefully, especially with the documents already being leaked, the HDMI Forum just says, you know what? Let's make it happen. You know what's probably going to happen? They're going to say, oh, it's okay, when they release the next version of HDMI, which is also going to have the exact same problem. But what do you think's going to happen? Ignore the text being different here. I totally didn't forget to record this until after doing the next video. But anyway, what do you think's going to happen? Do you actually think, like, they will just open it when the next version is out and we have the exact same problem? Do you think we're going to just forevermore never have anything? Or do you think there is going to be some world where maybe they change something? Or are we just going to ditch HDMI and do everything with DisplayPort? I can certainly work with that, but consoles are a bit of a problem right now. Consoles. We need the next console to have a DisplayPort. We need TVs with DisplayPort. And then HDMI just has to comply. Anyway, if you like the video, go subscribe as well. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to Daily Bear Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and HDMI just kind of sucks.